Welcome back to the live stage here at C2E2. I'm going to get that right this time. It's me again, Adam Swiderski, the editor-in-chief of SYFY WIRE. I was just here doing the morning kickoff, but now I'm here for a conversation with Cory Doctorow, author, activist, etc.
Yep.
Many, many hats worn.
Yep.
And we're here primarily talking about his new book, which I will hold up, called Radicalized, which is a collection of 4 novellas dealing with kind of some stuff that is real now, taken to certain extremes, I guess I would say.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things science fiction's really good at, is making a little thought experiment world where like one fact about our world is the totalizing fact, so that you can kind of get your head around these effects that are otherwise really subtle and hard to tease out.
Yeah.
You know, looking at questions about things like, what does it mean that our Internet of Things is being designed to extract as much money from us as possible while spying on us and turning our lives into a horrible technology dumpster fire? But, you know, that's a thing that's kind of all around us now, and you hear it in these little dribbles and drabbles about, you know, Alexa doing something awful. But by telling a story about people in refugee housing whose Internet of Things appliances are designed to like bleed them of every cent they have, and then to add insult to injury, they stop working, was you know, allows you to kind of bring those effects into more sharp relief.
So we have 4 stories with different themes.
Yeah.
Why collect them into this one collection? What's the unifying thread?
You know, I'd say the unifying thread is that the most important thing about technology and its relationship to human thriving is not what the technology does, but who it does it for and to. You know, there's a story in there about Superman intervening in an otherwise potentially fatal beating of a African-American man in New York by the same NYPD cops who killed Eric Garner. And these cops are there, and they've got cover because they're using algorithmic predictive policing tools that Batman sold the city, that Bruce Wayne sold the city. And it's, you know, the thing about predictive policing is that gathering data on what the cops do and using it to identify bias is a noble cause, but gathering data on what the cops do and using it to magnify bias is a terrible thing. And it's the same underlying technology, it's just what you do with the findings from the technology.
Yeah. So I kind of wanted to go through each story here and touch on one, because a lot of writers, there's like especially science fiction and speculative fiction writers, there's a moment that kind of sparks the idea. Mm-hmm. You know, you encounter something in the real world and you're like, oh, what if that was, you know, I just saw Us. And there's a moment at the beginning where it talks about how there's tunnels all over the country. And you have to think there was a moment where Jordan Peele was just like, man, what's up with all these tunnels, you know? Mm-hmm. So for I want to go through each of these stories and see what that spark was for you.
Yeah.
So for Unauthorized Bread, which was the one you were just talking about, proprietary technology.
Yeah, I've been working on these campaigns on this stuff for a long time. I work for a nonprofit called the Electronic Frontier Foundation. We're actually suing the US government on behalf of researchers at MIT and Johns Hopkins to repeal this law that makes it illegal to jailbreak your devices. And, you know, when that law kicked off in the Clinton years, it was like to stop you from opening up your DVD player. But now, you know, Johnson & Johnson sells an artificial pancreas with a glucose monitor and an insulin pump, and it takes proprietary insulin. And refilling your insulin pump without Johnson & Johnson's permission is a potential felony, right? So we're turning like human beings into walking inkjet printers. So, you know, that knowledge that's going on, and the way that we've been like frogs who've been slowly boiled over it, like there are plenty of people are like, well, why wouldn't Apple, the company who sold me my phone, get to decide which apps I can run on it? And the answer is, why wouldn't KitchenAid, the company that sold you your dishwasher, get to decide which dishes you can wash in it? Because it's yours.
So I feel like that's a pattern with a lot of technology law and regulation, is like, you know, the thing about keeping you from opening up your DVD player, messing with it, and now it's warped into this other thing. Is it the pace that causes that the pace of technological advancement that causes that kind of abuse of these regulations?
You know, I think there's a couple of things happening. So one is that computers are pervasive, right? So if you make a dumb mistake in how you regulate computers while you're thinking of them as an entertainment medium, those dumb decisions will ripple out into computers as they're used to like seismically damp this building during a high windstorm and keep it from falling down on our heads. Because we really only have one design for computers, so any way you regulate them, they will. But the other thing is that we've kind of reached the apex of 40 years Reagan-style regulation where companies have been allowed to get bigger and bigger and bigger by buying up all their competitors, and they used to be illegal. And now they exert all of this influence over the policy-making procedure, which means that any policy can only be evidence-based to the extent that it doesn't gore some rich person's ox, and rich people own a lot more oxes now. You know, like, lawmakers don't have to be experts in microbiology or epidemiology to make good rules that keep us from all dying of listeria. They don't have to be computer scientists to make good computer science rules. It's not that they can't, it's that they won't. And they won't because someone's getting rich by having the rules be terrible.
All right. So, moving on to model minority, I mean, superheroes obviously a hot topic at a con like this.
Sure.
Which came first, I guess, the idea of this extension of police brutality or the superhero model, or was it kind of all of the piece?
I was really moved by a book by Michael Chabon called The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and
Love
Clay,
that book, yeah.
which is a kind of fictionalized account, a fictionalized account of the two Jewish kids in Brooklyn who created Superman, and they created Superman as a kind of atavistic response to the unfolding horror across the Atlantic of the rise of Nazism. And they just were like, why can't we have an unkillable, unstoppable force that can just go punch racism until racism stops? And I'm sympathetic to that reaction when I think about this stuff. It makes me crazy. And I'm from Toronto. My parents used to live on Joe Shuster Way. You know, it's half of Superman's origin story is there. And, you know, reading about the death of Eric Garner, particularly Matt Taibbi's book, I Can't Breathe, I had that same reaction, right? Why didn't an ally step in? And then, you know, that's a question we're having now all over the place. Why is it that people with privilege aren't stepping in? And then when they do, there's another really important question, which is, where were you 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? And that's a question that Superman ends up having to answer rather. And, you know, one of the things that I really wanted to do was play with whose story it is. So it starts off being Superman's story, but very quickly it's the story of the man he rescues. And that it's his story, really. It's his fight to fight, and he's the one who's making Superman confront things like, where were you when Emmett Till was lynched, right? You've been fighting for truth, justice, in the American way through the entire civil rights period. Why weren't you on the bridge? And it was a really good exercise in thinking through some of those questions for myself as someone who's like a white passing Jewish guy who's, you know, my father was racialized, he was a Jewish refugee and was treated as a foreigner when he got to Canada. But by the time I come along, we've just become part of white culture. And I think there are a lot of Jews who got really complacent about that stuff until a bunch of dudes in Confederate uniforms started marching through Charlottesville chanting, "Jews will not replace us." It turns out the last people in the white privilege boat are the first people out of the white privilege boat, and maybe throwing our cause in with white privilege was the wrong choice to make.
Right.
You know?
But so, and I'd say that's a pretty hot debate right now about do you punch Nazis? You know, I mean, there's videos out of Richard Spencer getting punched in the face, and some people cheer and some people say, you know, that's not really the way to handle it. I mean, do you come down on one side or the other of that, or is that part of what you put into this story?
I think that punching Nazis won't end Nazism,
right.
But I don't rule out punching Nazis as a tactically sound measure, right? I think that we have to keep our eyes on the strategic goal, which is to discredit and end Nazism. And where punching Nazis achieves that goal, it's the right tactic, and where it doesn't, it's the wrong tactic.
Okay. I mean, Radicalized, it's pretty... The inspiration for that feels pretty clear based on the healthcare environment that we live in now. But was there a particular spark that for you turned it on this idea of terrorism being an end result of that?
Yeah. You know, I'm a Canadian. And every country, I've lived in lots of countries, every country I've lived in has its own blind spots, right? I lived in London for 13 years, and I'm here to tell you that plumbing is the opposite of British, right? If I live 1,000 years, I will never understand how a technologically advanced nation can get plumbing that wrong. Well, as a Canadian in America, I just don't understand how it is that the gun debate and the healthcare debate have been so bonkers, right? Like, people say things like, well, if we had healthcare, it wouldn't work. Like, I've lived in lots of places with healthcare. I'm telling you it works, right?
Yeah.
Or if we had gun control, it wouldn't reduce gun violence. That's not true either. I mean, there may be other reasons to want this or not want it, but like all the reasons given are things that are facially incorrect. So then it, you know, as you think about this stuff, it raises some really hard questions, right? Like, why is it that aggrieved white dudes kill their ex-wives like crazy and shoot brown people like crazy, but never shoot the healthcare executives whose callous decisions about what care is and isn't insured end up resulting in the death of the people they love and care about most in the world. How is it that those people are never shot? Not that I'm advocating doing it, but it's kind of a mystery. When you think about the kind of grievances that spark angry white men to kill women, for example, those grievances are a lot pettier than the grievances that many of us hold against, distant, impersonal healthcare executives. And, as the characters in this story discover, if you look middle class and respectable and white enough, you can stick a fertilizer bomb in your backpack and get all the way up to the C-suite of, Blue Shield or Kaiser or whatever. And so, the story kind of writes itself because it begs all these questions like, how long would it take us to call white dudes terrorists if the people they were killing were incredibly powerful, richer white dudes as opposed to, brown people in mosques? And, the answer I come up with is six bombings.
6 times. Okay.
Yeah. But, it also raises these important questions about radicalization and our story about radicalization, because our narrative about radicalization is that you have these normal people and they meet radicals, and the radicals use a mind control ray to make them into radicals, fellow radicals. That doesn't bear up under scrutiny or research. There's a really good bit of psych research out of Boston University about 10 years ago where they did case histories on suicide bombers in the West Bank. And they were asking, where do these people come from? Are they so ideological that they become suicidal, willing to die for the cause? And every case history they reviewed, it was the opposite way around. They were so traumatized that they were suicidal, and that made them vulnerable to someone who came along and said, don't waste your suicide. Use it to further, to strike back. And our response to radicalization isn't, let's see what we can do about these things that are traumatizing people that are making them fodder for radicalization. It's like that terrible apology that goes, I'm sorry you're angry at me.
Right.
It's like, I'm sorry you're traumatized. Could you please be less traumatized by the trauma? Not that we're going to do anything about the trauma per se. Just don't take it as personally, if you don't mind, right? And every right is taken. It's never given. And in every revolution, in every moment in which rights are taken, there are terrible and good people fighting for the cause, and sometimes it's hard to know who's who, and after the fact, people really regret it. George Orwell, very famously, he went and fought in the Spanish Civil War, and he fought against not just the fascists, but the Stalinists. He was shot through the throat by a Stalinist sniper, and at the end of his life, he was so upset with leftists in the UK who'd supported Stalin that he made a list of his friends who he thought were secret Stalinists and gave it to the cops so that they could put them under surveillance. This is George Orwell, right? So, after the fact, we always have these reckonings with the monsters that we supported, and because they were our monsters, and we have to figure out what we're gonna do about it. Yeah. And so that was the other thing I thought I could kind of dig into with that story.
Interesting. All right, so then the last one, Mask of the Red Death.
Yeah.
Very clearly a Poe reference.
Yes. I named my daughter after Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah.
She's Poesy, P-O-E-S-Y, like the French word.
Oh, that's awesome.
Whole name is Poesy Emmeline Fibonacci Nautilus Taylor Doctorow.
Etc. Right? It's one of the characters in your books.
Yeah.
But so survivalism, obviously the theme of this, and this idea among that we have certain people in the 1% who are planning for apocalyptic events. They have their bunkers in New Zealand. They've got a jet at the ready. Yeah. But again, was there a particular story that you read or something that kind of triggered this aspect of things in the book?
I think the first time I had this discussion, I have a friend, Alex Stefan, who used to edit a website called World Changing. He's an environmentalist. And he did this series of posts on what should be in your bug-out bag. And the more I read them, the worse I liked this idea of having a bug-out bag. And it struck me that when catastrophe strikes, and catastrophes strike, right? You don't have to be a pessimist to believe that there are catastrophes in our future. Engineers who assume that things will never break, they're not optimists, they're idiots, right? Like, that was what the guy who said, oh, we won't need lifeboats on the Titanic was thinking, right? So thinking that things will break down sometimes doesn't make you a pessimist, but thinking that the way to solve them is to run away and let other people figure it out makes you a terrible person. And moreover, when you dig into the fantasy of the bug-out bag, it's like, I will go and hide in the hills while the poors eat each other, and I'll come back, and I'll have my thumb drives full of bitcoins and my guns and my gemstone quality precious stones, and it'll be like the world's greatest Frazetta painting. You know, I'll be like a warlord and I'll have a harem and like all these dumbasses who are like getting things running again. They'll come under my protection. And, you know, not only is that a terrible thing to fantasize about, it also doesn't work because, you know, if everything were to break down and we couldn't get things like sanitation running again, we'd all be dead of cholera inside of a couple of months, right? And so this is about a guy who fancies himself one of the masters of the universe, who very quickly discovers that it doesn't matter how many guns you have, you can't shoot germs.
Right. I always feel like that's missing from the post-apocalyptic story. That was something in The Stand that I thought Stephen King did really well. It's the guy who like cuts his finger and then dies because there's no antibacterial medication anymore. You know?
Yeah, my dad came to visit us in LA last summer and got a kidney stone that freakishly went septic and then turned into septic shock. And you know, he was in the ICU for 6 days because a bacterium had a random mutation, and he would have been dead 5 times over if it wasn't for the fact that he was in the ER, in the ICU when he went into shock because he had just come out of surgery and they had a crash cart next to him, right? Like, you know, in the old days, you know, you would get a small cut on your finger and just drop dead a couple of days ago, a couple of days later. You know, this back to the land degrowth version of our future is a dead end, like a literal dead end, right? Depopulating the world by 4 billion people is not how we survive. It's how we all die of the communicable diseases that grow in the mountains of corpses that happen when you depopulate the world by 4 billion people.
Yeah. So let's talk about that concept of pessimism that you mentioned, because I've seen other interviews with you in which you talk about the fact that you're not pessimistic about the future, but more about the present, or because there is a dystopian aspect to a lot of the stuff you write. But I've also read you say that you're not pessimistic about the future. Could you expand on that?
Well, so I think that optimism and pessimism are both predictions, and they're both kind of fatalistic ones. Optimism goes like, everything will be fine, don't worry, and pessimism goes, everything will be terrible, don't bother. And you know, if that were true, right, if what we did didn't matter, then there'd be no reason to get out of bed. I think that we changed the world, right? I have a colleague, Ada Palmer, who's a science fiction writer, lives here in Chicago, teaches at the University of Chicago. She's a Renaissance history expert. She teaches about Florence and the Renaissance. And she does this super awesome thing with her undergrads every year. She has a 4-week-long reenactment of the election of the Medici's Pope, where it's a LARP, where everyone has a character that they play and they like wheel and deal and betray each other.
I was missing that stuff when I went to school. That's not fair.
Oh my God, it's awesome. And they dress up and they have like ruffled collars. It's so awesome. And then at the end of every round of this LARP every year, there are a couple of people who are in the running to be the Pope, who are always the same. And there are always a couple of people who are different, because the choices that individuals make change outcomes. And so, you know, it's true that like the forces of history are at work, right? That's why those 2 people were always going to be in the final 4. And, you know, those forces of history were set in motion by choices people made in the last round and the last. But there's always some room within the forces of history for our individual agency. And so for me, I'm much more concerned about hope than pessimism or optimism. And hope for me is the idea that if you take a step that materially improves your circumstances, that you will attain a new perch from which you might spy another step you can take, right? In computer science, we call this hill climbing, where if you don't know how to get across a very complicated terrain, but you want to get to the highest point in it, you imagine that you have like an ant, and its forward-facing eyes can't look up and see where the high ground is, but it has all these legs, and it knows which leg is on the highest ground, and it takes a step that way, and now its legs are reconfigured, and it takes a step that way and that way. And by following the gradient one step at a time, you can ascend the gradient to the nearest peak, right? I think that like when your ship sinks at sea, you have to tread water, not because you are likely to be picked up, but because it's the necessary but insufficient condition for being rescued. And that's what hope is, right? It's the belief that if you do something, you might find something else to do. And so I'm hopeful, right? That's why I got out of bed this morning. That's why I get out of bed every morning.
But I will say that in the world we live in now, and this applies not just to technology, although we do see that now, but also something like climate change, where, you know, you've got these big forces, in technology terms, giant corporations with lots of money, lots of power, who are pervasive throughout our lives. And it can feel, I think, to individuals like there's nothing I as an individual can do to stop that tide. What would you say to an individual on that
That's
level?
totally true.
Yeah.
You as an individual can't change climate change, right? Like, that's the problem, is we've had 40 years of framing all of our problems in terms of individual choice, responsibility, and agency. We have a collective opportunity to do something about climate change. The reason all of our efforts to fix climate change so far have completely failed is because we put all the emphasis on individuals. Like, you know, if only you were recycling more, right? Then in 40 years we wouldn't be digging through rubble with sticks for canned goods and drinking our own urine. And if we are, it'll be because you didn't separate your waste stream. So what's really amazing is we have things like the Green New Deal, which are changing our policy debate. You know, and the Green New Deal went from like something that someone had doodled on the back of a napkin to something with more than 50% of Americans supporting it in a hot second. And you know, it's tempting to think that we live in a world that is heavily polarized between people who believe one thing and people who believe another and inhabit two different realities. But in a bunch of places where it matters, that's not the case, right? Net neutrality is supported by 87% of Americans. That is a shocking number, not just because, you know, it's not the law of the land, but also because net neutrality is a thing that, to understand it, you have to both care about competition policy and telecoms policy, and the Venn diagram overlap of that, it's not like, it's not a shape, it's a sphincter, right? And the fact that like 87% of Americans really have a favorable view of network neutrality is amazing. And the fact that in Washington, network neutrality is viewed as a polarizing thing that is not politically possible doesn't tell you that we are polarized. It tells you that we exist in an anti-majoritarian moment with absolute tyranny by a minority. And they are powerful, but they are not numerous, right? We don't live in a polarized moment. We live in a moment where a small group of special interests have hijacked our political process. And that is true with climate change. It's true with gender equality, it's true with gay marriage, it's true with marijuana legalization, it's true in so many of these things, with healthcare, with gun control, that we think of as deeply polarizing. And it's true that the people on the absolutist side of these debates have deeply felt beliefs that are very important to them. But we aren't polarized in the sense that there are two numerous groups that are in opposition to one another. We are polarized in the sense that there is a broad consensus and a tiny rump of lunatics who oppose the consensus, but the lunatics are running the asylum.
Right. And one of the things I think that's interesting about this when it pertains to technology is that it seems like it's hard for people. This stuff is just so pervasive. It's like you see stories about Facebook violating someone's privacy or the way that and then what I see is my friends all posting that story on Facebook,
sure.
You know, or people talking about how Twitter is bad or whatever, but they're posting it on Twitter. So what's the solution there when this stuff is so intrinsic to the fabric of our lives?
So the reason that happens is that it's not bad or undesirable to have a place where all your friends are to talk with them, right? That's actually good. That's why Facebook has become so powerful. The problem is that Facebook has been allowed to grow to the point where they own all of their competitors. So Facebook in America lost its biggest group of users ever last year. 15 million 13 to 34-year-olds left Facebook. The majority of them went to Instagram. Now, under normal circumstances, Facebook owns Instagram.
Right, I was gonna say that.
Under normal circumstances, that is to say the pre-Reagan antitrust world, Instagram could never become a division of Facebook because companies weren't allowed to grow by buying their competitors, right? The reason everyone is still on Facebook is we need Facebook, or a thing like Facebook. The reason Facebook is a problem is they are so big that we can't discipline them through our individual choices by moving from one to the other. But you have now Elizabeth Warren saying, let's break up Facebook. And you have Marguerite Vestager, who's the European Antitrust Commissioner, who just fined Google another 5 billion euros for failure to comply with antitrust rules. There is a temptation to think that because these firms get away with so much, and because their all-out blitz when they're challenged is so total and pervasive, that they are at the peak of their power. But there's two times in which you see people lashing out and not countenancing any kind of challenge, right? One is when they're so big that they can crush their opposition, and the other one is when their perch is so precarious that they worry that any opposition will grow to take them out. And we don't know which one we're in right now, but I like to hope, that word again, that we're at a tipping point, right? You know, when you have a problem whose cause and effect are separated by a lot of time and space, it's hard to even know that the problem is there. climate change, right? Like if every time, you turn on your car, it got a little warmer where you were, it'd be really obvious. The problem with climate change is it's 40 years off that you feel the consequences. Now, if the problem is real, the task of convincing people that the problem exists solves itself because people's lives are destroyed, right? Well, ideally, you would like to hasten the moment of peak indifference to minimize the number of people whose lives are destroyed, but also because you want the moment of peak indifference to come before the point of no return, right? If the day I convince you that we need to care about rhino populations is the day that there's only one rhino left, it's really tempting to say, well, we might as well figure out what it tastes like, right?
Yeah.
And so, this battle between nihilism and denial, or peak indifference and the point of no return, that's the fight we're fighting. And the fact that people on Facebook care about it, that they're using Facebook to make people aware that Facebook is a dumpster fire, that's great, right? It's more of that will help Liz Warren break up Facebook when the day comes. And I'm a Zucker vegan. I don't have an account on Facebook. I don't have an account on Instagram. I don't have an account on WhatsApp. But I acknowledge that there are people who need those accounts, and I want them to be safe. I don't want them to have to leave Facebook to be safe. I want Facebook to be under democratic accountable control, so that people who make a different choice to me don't have their lives destroyed by the venality of Mark Zuckerberg.
And real quick at the end here, I feel like we've seen a shift in science fiction's relations to technology over the past decade or so. I mean, you have shows like Black Mirror, incredibly popular.
Sure.
And I don't know that, the 60s were an incredibly tumultuous time, but gave us Star Trek, which is a very utopian vision.
And Planet of the Apes.
Well, that's true. That's a good point. I mean, do you think it's that it's just the sign of the times that we have this darker view of what technology is doing to us now?
Yeah, I think technology is not predictive, but it's reflective, right? If you want to know what's like in our subconscious anxiety and aspiration about technology, look at which science fiction is popular, and it's predicting the present, right? It's not predicting the future, but the present is the standing wave where the past is becoming the future. So if you can reflect the present, you can change the future. And certainly we're at a moment where the inability to adequately regulate technology and other industries has given rise to all kinds of crises. And when you hear like Elon Musk saying like someday artificial intelligence will take over and enslave us, like, I have a doctorate in computer science. I think that's garbage. But I'll tell you what, if I was like a Xanax popping, obviously miserable entrepreneur dude whose company was like destroying his life and sending him into these crazy Twitter spirals, it would be really easy for me to think that our giant automated, transhuman artificial life forms, which, is a limited liability company, was going to take over our lives and destroy it. So the fact that Elon Musk is worried about AI tells you a lot about his relationship to business, very little about his relationship to AI.
All right. I feel like we can talk so much about these. These are big topics. A lot of them covered in the book Radicalized by Cory Doctorow. You can check that out. Are you appearing at the con here?
No, I've already done them, but they've got a stack of signed copies over at Anderson's. And if you catch me, I'll be around today. If you catch me, I'll make the book non-returnable with a Sharpie. So
great. Thank you so much for joining us. Up next on the live stage, we have a Black Panther round table.
Excellent.
With all creators of that.